Just let me know when we're live, please. Welcome. This is a Center for Private International Enterprise virtual event. It is being recorded. And if you would like to communicate any technical problems, or more interestingly, if you would like to communicate any questions to the panelists, please do so using the chat function. My name is Michelle Crimes, and I am a program officer here at SIPE. I will be moderating this event, which is the third in the series of events hosted by ACGC and our friends in Constructive Capital. I will also be moderating our question and answer session. It is now my pleasure to turn things over to our Executive Director, Andrew Wilson. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Michelle, and good morning, everyone. As Michelle said, I'm Andrew Wilson, the Executive Director of the Center for International Private Enterprise, or SIPE as we call it. You might hear SIPE referred to during today's presentation. And on behalf of SIPE, I'd like to extend my welcome to you to the Unintended Democratic Dividends of Voluntary Standards, a virtual event featuring 3 experts in measuring environmental, social, and governance standards, creating and maintaining voluntary standards, and using these ESG standards to develop democratic institutions. As Michelle said, this event is the third in a series organized by our ACGC Center in collaboration with our Constructive Capital thought leaders. The focus of today's event is how companies and local governments can benefit from adhering to voluntary standards. We're starting a conversation today to discuss the ways in which multinational corporations seeking to decrease their risk in emerging markets come together to develop voluntary ESG standards. These standards are designed to decrease a multinational's exposure to risk, but the standards may also strengthen local democratic institutions. We want to understand those standards and then understand the accountability structures that they create. Today's moderator and speakers bring a wealth and depth of knowledge in this area. Michelle Crimes, as our site program officer, will moderate today. Michelle's a former attorney specializing in anti-corruption and compliance investigation, and she brings real-world experience to the discussion about developing and adhering to standards. Gabriel Toomey is a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. He'll help us understand how multinational corporations interpret and incorporate ESG standards as they seek to decrease risk in emerging markets. Dan Strechay is currently the Director of Global Outreach and Engagement with the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. He'll give us insights into how stakeholders help establish and maintain voluntary standards. And finally, we'll hear from SIPE's in-house expert, Eric Hans. Eric is the Deputy Regional Director for Europe and Eurasia and provides thought leadership on SIPE's Constructive Capital initiative. He'll help us understand the intersection between voluntary standards and democratic institutions. With that, I welcome you once again to today's discussion on the unintended democratic dividends of voluntary standards. And I happily turn the microphone over to today's moderator, Michelle Crimes.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Andrew. We appreciate it. Now, I would like to begin with our first presenter, Gabriel Toomey. Andrew has already laid out the format of the discussion, so we'll just allow Gabriel to just go right ahead and start with his presentation. Over to you, Gabriel.
Thank you, Michelle. And thank you all for attending today, wherever you may be. We're very grateful to be able to support this education event. So jumping right in. Right now, we're in a period called the Great Acceleration. It's the most profound transformation of the human relationship with the natural world in the history of humankind. The Anthropocene. The Anthropocene refers to the Earth's current geologic time period, which began at the last glacial period around 8,000 BC. In the Anthropocene, human activity has dramatically altered numerous Earth systems. This acceleration of this transformation that is putting people and planet at risk can be observed in the various dimensions of the Great Acceleration concept. The Great Acceleration concept impacts democracy and communities around the world. And it's one way that current portfolio managers are considering how to look at investing around the world. It's a way of approaching voluntary standards, which I'll explain shortly. Next slide, please. As you saw in the Great Acceleration in the previous slide, we've seen an increase in GDP, an increase in life expectancy, but at the same time, an increase in natural or planetary boundary stresses, such as climate change, biodiversity loss, and other issues. So what is the regenerative economic theory that's driving this? Given the global risks we are facing, we no longer have the luxury of being less bad. Instead, we must be purposely good, focusing on regenerating the social foundation and ecological function of our planet. Much of this is based on improving our ability to connect data, whether through voluntary standards, with investment processes, which I'll explain shortly. Can you go to the next slide, please? Enter ESG, environmental social governance. Environmental social governance is a process that socially responsible investors employ globally. It's a way of incorporating non-financial information into the investment processes. While it's colloquially separated into environmental, social, and governance, as you can see in the screen, these factors all overlap. This requires transparency and better understanding of data to make improved business decisions within the capstone or the framework of planetary boundaries within the Anthropocene. This is the type of analysis that's often reported in FT, moral money, which maybe some of you might receive. And recently, I had the privilege of being highlighted in. Next slide, please. Jumping right in, now we're going to look at a set of environmental social governance factors to briefly explain them. We're not going to look at all of them. To give you an idea of how many factors are out there, Bloomberg, the data platform, has over 1,300 different ratios and metrics associated with environmental social governance. So today, we are certainly not going to go through 1,300 metrics, but if you could, but I think my time would be cut off by Michelle very quickly. So let's look at climate change. As many of us may realize, climate change is increasing. Whatever the source may be, whether it's Anthropocene, human-derived, or natural cycle, it is occurring. The data tells us it is occurring, and it is having significant impacts, most of them negative, and at times positive, but most of them negative on infrastructure and business and communities globally. We can look at over the 30 named storms, for example, that have come out of the Atlantic this year, the highest number of tropical storms in history. Right now, we're on the path to achieving 3 to 4 degrees Celsius possibly within our lifetimes, certainly by 2100. That's up to 8 or 9 degrees Fahrenheit, an increase in 8 to 9 degrees Fahrenheit. That may not seem like a big deal, but when you start to understand the health and economic impacts that has on communities and on the stability of countries, it is quite significant, and it is material. This is why mainstream organizations like Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch are all have tools available now to incorporate environmental social governance factors, including specifically climate change, into their credit rating methodologies at the sovereign level around the world. An example of this recently is what occurred in Argentina. Argentina went through a disastrous drought in 2017 and 2018. The drought was magnified significantly by climate change. That drought caused Argentina to decrease its treasury tax receipts, the dollar-denominated receipts its central bank received from the export of soy, by over $1 billion. And and first time in recorded history, Argentina, one of the top 3 soy producers in the world, had to import soy from my home state in Minnesota all the way down to Argentina to be processed and then exported from Argentina to EU to meet EU euro-denominated contracts. That $1 billion loss in 2018 is a significant driver of the destabilization and change in politics that occurred in 2019 and 2020 with the election of the new left-wing government. Next slide, please. Look at the biodiversity ecosystem. Again, another abstract concept. What does this mean? Well, we can see that there are globally a significant amount of the biodiversity on the planet is threatened. Yes, that's a natural resource science concept, but what does it have to do with democracy, data, and transparency? It has everything to do with data and transparency and the stabilization of countries. As is now being reported frequently in the US financial press, such as the Wall Street Journal, pollinator loss in the US is a significant risk to the agriculture breadbasket of the US, California. If we lose bees, bumblebees, honeybees, right? If we lose bees due to the wasps that are coming in from Canada, that the Asian, I forget what they're called, tiger wasp or something, right? It's 5 times the size. That could have a significant impact on most of the agriculture we eat each day. So biodiversity loss has a significant impact on the stabilization of communities and democracy around the world. Can you please go to the next slide? Thank you. Well, then we have water stress. Now, water stress is a little bit more easy to understand, right? Think of the small, medium-sized enterprise in the Intermountain West, Utah, Eastern Oregon, Eastern Washington State, for example, Idaho. Well, let's say those businesses are dependent on agricultural production, or have a significant amount of revenues are dependent on agricultural production. Okay. Well, if the rains do not arrive, or if the rain's too much, because both rain's not arriving and too much rain are both impacted by climate change. That's why we have that both events or extreme weather events happening simultaneously around the world, which is quite confusing. Hey, this climate change is happening. What's that to do with water? Well, you have too much rain and sometimes not enough rain. Well, if I'm a farmer and I'm borrowing from the local bank, this is where it gets real, and I do not have enough revenue from my cash crop, I will then end up having a delay in payment on loans from the bank, or the loans to Caterpillar from my equipment. Those loans are aggregated in small Intermountain Bank accounts, in increasing 90-day past due loans and 120-day past due loans, putting economic stress and financials on the community and financial stress on that bank. So stress tests of banks are now showing water stress. Water stress is a global phenomenon, and it's a significant risk that is significantly impacting investors today. Going to the next slide, please. Now let's look at S. This is the stepchild of environment, social, and governance. If you just look at the number of metrics that are available in E, S, and G around the world, using Bloomberg as an example, in E, there's about 550. Governance, about the same amount too. S, 200. Now, why? Because there has not been enough research or analysis on S, or there's not been enough effort to link S to how companies perform. I will walk you through that process now. You can certainly read the screen. I'll let you read. I don't need to read that for you. But I'm going to talk about something called cost of goods sold in the income statement. It's the cost of production for a widget, or the cost of production, in this case, of palm oil, which Dan will talk about shortly. In that cost includes the labor costs. Oh, that's where S arrives. In that labor cost, we know how much palm oil a single individual can produce. So we know if there's missing reporting, or the lack of reporting, or inconsistent reporting on the number of people working on a palm oil concession. This is consistent across all agriculture in the world. We have a very good understanding about the number of people it takes to produce how many avocados, right? That's pretty easy math to do. But when you have too few people measured by too few dollars in that cost of goods account, you know, I'm missing some money that should have been paid to laborers and to individuals around the world. That's how you can start to measure, for example, forced labor. And forced labor, and very sadly, what some call slave labor, is a significant component of all of our agricultural production around the world, including, sadly, in the United States. Next slide, please. The G factor, corporate governance. This is a lot easier to understand. I mean, we all come from mainstream finance or business backgrounds, or been working in civil society for years, or so. What the key things to think about from a corporate governance perspective are, okay, let's look at diversity of leadership. Why? Because more diversity has a broader diversity of conversations, and that improves the risk management of the organizations. You know, just if I analyze plastics during my day, right? If I look at companies and they're all like, well, sea level rise isn't going to impact and storm surge are not going to impact the plastics producers in Lake Charles, Louisiana, and we all agree to that because we all have the same point of view, that could be a risk to the organization. You know, that's why having the ability to have a broad discussion about multiple ideas at the executive level is very important. That's why diversity matters. Similarly for stewardship. And now, when you look here, just talking specifically about financial performance and corruption, globally, the ease of doing business is improving for corporations around the world. It's easier for corporations to move their capital and function around the world. That's a good thing. At the same time, corporations are increasingly seeking out tax havens around the world. Many U.S. multinational corporations now pay effectively zero tax to the U.S. government. That may be fine for their shareholders, but they're using and consuming U.S. resources. Should they not contribute? That's a conversation we need to have. Next slide, please. Now, looking at board composition, this is where I was one step ahead of myself, or this is where diversity really matters, but so does tenure and independence. We look at it's very clear as we look at the data, for example, on gender and board diversity. We start to see that when we look at U.S. corporations that are publicly traded in articles published by, I'm going to make a joke here, the radical environmental organization Bloomberg. Of course, they're not. They're a stated, stodgy corporation, and a great corporation. I'm a huge fan. But if we look at what they've reported on gender and board diversity, they have demonstrated that with increasing the diversity in gender at the board level, you start to see financial outperformance of companies. Why? Because you have broader conversations that can then look at risk from a more effective perspective. Let's go to the next slide, please. So what does this mean in practice? ESG has 8 ways of looking at risk. These are 8 different categories as defined by the Global Association of Risk Professionals. If you need more information, just let me know, please. I can, with Michelle, I can share that information with you offline, because I know these are technical definitions. But what is very important for you to understand is that risk control is imperative and drives financial results. And risk control requires data, and better data that's more transparently available improves risk management. I'll let you read the slides, but I want to give you an example of some of these, of how this works. Okay, next slide, please. Can go to the next slide, please, if you don't mind. Okay. Thank you very much. We just have a couple more slides and they'll be done for the day, and you can go on to you listen to my other speakers who are probably a lot more interesting than me. But here's a look at legal and regulatory risks. Remember, they move from the left to the right on the previous slide. The direct risk always occurs in operations, and the other 7 risks are indirect, and where in this way you have a cause and an effect. Enron engaged in multiple accounting and pricing frauds that led to the company ultimately being delisted. What did this do to their shareholders in particular? And they all lost their money. But in particular, the 20,000 employees that worked at Enron, they themselves saw their pension disappear. That's destabilization. You can read the slide about Exxon similarly. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about credit, legal, and strategic risks. In credit, PG&E, the California utility, has now been labeled what one would call the first climate bankruptcy. They did not have, and they were not providing investors transparent data about their about their grid, and how their grid was overshadowed in many cases physically by trees, and that ended up sparking multiple fires. Those fires ended up having a significant and horrific result to the communities. Many people lost their lives. Many tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of acres burned, and the corporation was fined. The corporation went out of business. What would have happened if the corporation had been more transparent about its grid and the overlying trees above those grid? Literally, physically, the trees were over the grid. They could have done a better job of managing that risk. Let's go to the next slide, please. This will be your final slide for today. Now, this slide links to Dan's talk. Let's talk about palm oil. Palm oil is an agricultural product valued at about $70 to $80 billion globally. That's the amount of trade globally. It's in about in a significant portion of all the products on any grocery shelf, maybe 30 to 40%. Palm oil is a useful product. It has many different types of oil product. Different types of products come out of palm oil that can have different heating points, so it can be used at different types of cooking. And also different can be used in cosmetics and many other uses. At the same time, palm oil is grown in the tropics, and where palm oil is grown has driven significant amount of deforestation around the world and resulted in an enormous amount of greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity loss, and subsequent also has many social risks associated with it. Here's an example of a company, Noble Group, an energy trader that many of us may know from back from I used to work in on trading, so I used to work. You had to see their securities pass my desk. Now, they were one of the 100 largest companies on earth in 2013. They now have been delisted. They went through any number of financial accounting standards scandals. Those scandals were driven by the lack of transparency. In 2017, RSPO and some other organizations, including their lead creditor, HSBC, said, hey, as you can see on the table on the slide, they misvalued their their palm oil concessions by $135 million. At that time, their market capitalization was $325 million. They misvalued those concessions because they were not being transparent about the quantity of the trees, which Dan can explain a little bit more in detail, on those 200,000 acres of rainforest. Now, what happened is when they were actually priced according to market value, the price was $67 million when they sold those plantations a year and a half ago. What that meant was that the company was not, had overstated its assets, lied to investors, and their share price became effectively zero. The sovereign wealth fund of the United Arab Emirates lost, I believe, $60 million in their investment in Noble Group. So transparency matters. It impacts democratic institutions globally. It impacts institutions at many different levels, whether they're individual through slave and forced labor, sadly, for smallholders, more broadly at pension funds in the case of the UAE. So with this, I'd like to pass it off to the other presenters. And if you have any questions, please email us, and we can easily have further conversations along with CIPE to support your better understanding ESG and how transparency matters to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gabrielle. So now we'll hear from Dan Stretche. And before we do that, I just want to point out maybe 3 things that would be important to sort of hold in your mind from this last presentation. So one is that keep in mind how corporations view what we call environmental, social, and governance standards, and how they try to come up with their standards and how they try to implement or perhaps not implement those standards in the way that they operate daily. The other thing is that there are consequences and that there are risks. I think what Gabrielle was able to show us is that there are certain consequences, and that those consequences directly tie to a risk that sort of also fall along the line of an ESG standard. And the last most important thing is transparency matters. I think that's an important thing to hold in your mind as you listen to both Dan, and then he'll be followed up by Eric. So with that, I'm going to pass things over to Dan. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, SIPE, for having me here today. I'm probably not your normal speakers, having someone talk about palm oil. And thank you, Gabrielle, for that really interesting insight. I particularly like the point on the board diversity and how that can impact gender issues, something that I'd love to explore a little bit more. It's great to be here with Gabrielle and Eric on this panel. But I'm going to just jump right into it. So I represent the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. And if you go to the next slide, palm oil, as Gabrielle mentioned, is a crop. It's a crop that's grown typically 10 to 15 degrees from the equator, and has been something that we've seen countries really focus on as a way of alleviating social economic issues and to pull people out of poverty. And if you look at the growth of oil palm in Indonesia and Malaysia, and now back to Africa, it's an African plant, and in Latin America, there has been a focus to use the crop either in post-conflict areas such as in West Africa or in areas of Colombia, to encourage young men to go back to work, to put down their arms and to grow the oil palm, which is an extremely high yielding plant. And if you look at this chart that I'm presenting here, if you think about where the equator is and that 10 to 20 degrees, a lot of some of the poorest populations on Earth also live and work in that area where the oil palm is grown. If you go to the next slide, what you see is you also have the highest amount of biodiversity that still exists on this planet is in that region. So what you have really is this cocktail for conflict, where you have a lot of emerging economies, you have a lot of people trying to get out of poverty or living at the poverty level. And then you also have biodiversity and standing rainforests and lots of primary forests. So this cocktail for conflict exists where you have two competing interests. You have a push to preserve the biodiversity, and then you have a push many times from governments or local provincial governments to create economy, to pull people out of poverty, to have infrastructure built. And that kind of this conflict, this inherent conflict between these two missions is really what led to the founding of the RSPO. If you go to the next slide, we were founded in 2004. We're an international nonprofit organization. We're a voluntary standard. The companies that sign up, and there's about 5,000 that are now members of the RSPO, do so voluntarily. And it really stems from one of the biggest issues, one of the hallmark issues, the trademarks of the oil palm production is an annual haze, a burning that takes place, which is fire has traditionally been used to clear land. And Migros, one of our founders, their executives were going to Singapore for meetings, and their flight was diverted to Kuala Lumpur. And what they realized is they didn't want to be part of this burning, this haze, this problem that was blanketing parts of Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. And they wanted to do something about it. And what they did is they started to look for partners. They found MPOA, which is the Malaysian Palm Oil Association, Unilever, and a refiner named AAK. And they all came together to try to tackle these issues, to say, how do we take this industry and how do we make it better? What they quickly realized is, what started as a small table had to get much bigger. And what you needed to do was to also come up with a solution that wouldn't dictate just from one side. There's a lot of voluntary standards and pre-competitive spaces, which are really just one category. You'll have a group of consumer goods manufacturers or a group of retailers, and they will set up a standard and they'll say, here's our standard, you have to comply with it. The approach of the RSPO was to take all of the actors, including civil society, including environmental and social NGOs, banks and investors, and bring them to the table. We, inherently, the consumer goods manufacturers and the oil palm growers and the processors and traders are going to want to be involved. But let's have them all at the table. And the reason for that is, if you look at a lot of the conversation, you have black and white solutions proposed. You have the Western nations like the US and nations in Europe saying, just produce the oil palm this way and it will be completely sustainable. On the other hand, you have the countries on the ground, or the producer nations, saying, actually, it's already sustainable and just let us develop our agricultural sector and it'll be fine. The RSPO exists not in a black and white solution, but in the gray space. We are very much trying to play in this area where we come up with a solution that everyone has to give up a little bit of something. And, in the US, we used to have a lot of bipartisan legislation, and I forget who said it, maybe it was Tip O'Neill, who said, you knew when you passed good legislation because everyone was a little bit unhappy. And because everyone had to give up something. That's essentially what the RSPO is. We ask everyone to give up a little bit of their position to help us pull this massive industry out from the shadows of being kind of hidden away in far off locations and plantations, and pull them into the sunlight to encourage transparency. And what we do is we actually have created a somewhat democratic organization of voluntary members, where our governance structure is one of consensus. We have an elected board of governors, and we have an elected a general assembly, which is actually next week, where our members vote on the rules. They vote on the standards, and everyone has to come together and create these standards, and then we vote on them. If you go to the next slide, our standard is pretty progressive. We are a no deforestation standard. Which means that they're high conservation value forests and high carbon stock forests cannot be cut down. There's no new planting on peat, and there's no use of fire. Our members volunteer to go beyond what's required on the local jurisdictions in terms of human rights. And that includes the fact that they've voted for and we're in the process of implementing a decent living wage while we do the calculations globally of what's a decent living wage look like in the palm oil sector globally, in places like Colombia, Indonesia, Malaysia. No one's done that work, but our members have asked us, the RSPO Secretariat, to do that work. We have, I think importantly for our conversation today, our first principle is behave ethically and transparently. And if you read up about the RSPO or you read up about our membership, we're often in the news, and it's not always good. And I think there's a reason for that, because these are the members, these are the organizations that have decided to go beyond what's being required of them, and they're putting their head up. And I think that's an extremely important process, because we need to have people stand up and talk about the issues that impact this industry. And that can be human rights violations and human rights issues. That can be continued deforestation. It could be bad practices such as Gabrielle mentioned about the former member of the RSPO, but there's also accountability with that. The fact that you're going to be transparent means that civil society, organizations like Gabrielle works for during and has previously worked for, are keeping an eye on our members, and that's an extremely important concept. It also means that we're keeping an eye on them. We rely on a system of third-party verification for our membership, which includes audits, which includes auditing their trade flows. You know, if you ship, how much are you shipping out? It includes taking a look at their concessions and taking a look at what their forest land bank looks like. As I mentioned, our standard is no deforestation, and it uses two systems called, or two toolkits called high conservation value and high carbon stock. And if companies are found to have these types of forest on their concessions, they can't cut them down. That can lead to what has been called stranded assets, where they're given a concession, and but many of us agree that these are really important to fighting off climate change and to preserving biodiversity. So they have to leave them standing, and that can cause some issues. That can cause some issues with the local governors or government, because usually they want that land developed. But our members have made that commitment, and we are set up to enforce that commitment. It has led to issues where we've had to suspend or terminate members. We try not to do that. Quite honestly, we prefer to suspend a member because then we can work on an action plan to remediate the situation. We lose our leverage as a voluntary organization when we kick people out of it. So we want to encourage people to stay within the organization and to improve it, because the goal of our organization is not to say that everything's perfect. No, we actually, as a voluntary standard, we need the bad actors to join the RSPO as much as we need the good actors. If we're only working on the good actors, we're creating this niche supply chain that's going to be great for Western markets, but is going to completely miss out on the two largest markets for palm oil, which are India and China. So what we ask from our membership is to take this initiative, to be transparent, to talk about what they're doing, to talk about their policies, and to welcome the oversight of not just the RSPO, but also of civil society. And I think that what it's done is we now certify about 20% of the overall global production of palm oil, which we know we need to get that remaining 80% or a big bulk of it. But 1/5 of the material produced is now falling under our standard. And I think that's important. And I think it helps also lead the way for others. Importantly, we are, actually, if you go to the next slide, we have rolled out a new standard, a standalone standard, a revised version of, or a simplified version of our main flagship standard called the Principles and Criteria, which is the Independent Smallholder Standard. And the really important aspect of that program is that we realize that we're really good at the large plantations, the folks that are ISO certified, the folks that have good systems, that they can really embrace the RSPO principles and criteria. What we found is trying to certify someone at the lowest level of production and 2 hectares of land, and at the poverty level, the standard didn't work. It didn't work. So we rolled out a new standard. Our membership adopted a new standard, which is going to focus on these smallholders and focus on a stepwise approach to take them out of poverty and to start improving their livelihoods by incentivizing good practices. And what we've seen in the past 2 years of these haze cycles where burning is used to clear land, we've had 0 fires on any RSPO smallholder. And when you start to consider that, how big a deal that is, as we've seen higher and higher rates for non-concession land being burned in Indonesia and Malaysia, it's really important to see that economic incentive be driven down to the lowest level. Additionally, we've seen really good performance of certified RSPO members, and Gabrielle used to do work with climate advisors, and they created an index that looked at RSPO members versus non-RSPO members and how they performed. And the fact is, companies that are RSPO members outperform. Transparency and accountability leads to better returns for investors, and that's something that we really want to highlight for others, companies that might want to take this journey and start on the practice or implementing the practices that will improve their operations and eventually drive more money and accountability to the ground level. Conscious of time, with that, I would just love to turn it back over to Michelle.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Dan. And I realize that you may seem like an unlikely guest, but one, RSPO is a great friend of SIPE and our project and our work in Indonesia, and we hope in the future, and we'll continue to collaborate together. But also, what we wanted to be able to talk about with everyone today was some things that you highlighted, right? The cocktail for conflict, which I thought was a great sort of analogy there, so that we can understand that what RSPO does is it brings a standard that helps to sort of mitigate what's happening there, right? And that some of the key concepts of transparency and of behaving good, for lack of a better way to describe it, is very important. So now I'm going to turn things over to Eric, and he's going to sort of make the final connection for us and sort of talk about how the concept of transparency and how transparency matters, how these ideas that are set up in a standard like RSPO really helps to support and sustain democracy. So with that, Eric, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Michelle, and I hope I can do a good job tying things together after such great presentations by Gabrielle and Dan. Hopefully, all these concepts come together. If not, you can tell me about it in the chat after the presentation. If we can go to the first slide. Okay, so let's take a step back and look at a construct of capital investment and investment more broadly. We've been working at SIPE on this concept of corrosive and constructive capital for about the past 2 or 3 years now, looking at primarily emerging markets where investment is coming in and what that investment is doing in that market. What we've seen from our partners, and after some study, is really a spectrum on which we have at one end of the spectrum corrosive capital, and on the other end constructive capital. Now, this corrosive capital enters the market in an opaque manner. It's not accountable to local stakeholders. That is, it avoids labor standards, it avoids any environmental regulations that are on the book. It seeks to elude rather than to comply. And in many cases, this type of corrosive investment is not necessarily market-oriented. On the other end of the scale, we have constructive capital investments, and these are transparent, so you understand if the investment is coming in, from Unilever, you know exactly, that Unilever stands behind that investment and is investing, in your nation in this specific project. You understand what that means. We think that there's another category that it's responsible and responsive to stakeholders. That is, that it engages with local institutions that are on the ground. It seeks to create new institutions, new voluntary standard organizations, like the Palm Oil Association. And that this investment is generally more market-oriented and profit-motivated, which goes to those ESG standards that Dan mentioned, where by engaging in transparency and accountability, you're actually increasing return to shareholders. Go to the next slide. So since we're talking about rainforests and all of the environmental standards here today, through Dan's presentation, I'd like to use this an ecosystem allegory. And that is that, you know, finance and investment are the water, right? It's the cash is what makes the economy go, for lack of a better word. Now that cash or that investment can be plentiful or it can be scarce, and it can carry nutrients or poison. So on the one end of the spectrum, we have corrosive capital, but this capital investment carries negative connotations or negative characteristics with it. It poisons the environment around it. It degrades it. It seeks to exploit rather than to build. On the other end, we have constructive capital, which carries those nutrients. It has positive externalities, and it creates a virtuous cycle where other players want to come in, other players want to join and be part of this process of building something that is sustainable and offers more and more opportunities. Next slide. So that brings us to the question at CYPAS, how do we, ignoring for the moment, setting aside for the moment corrosive capital, how would we go about promoting constructive capital? I'm looking at 4 core areas: corporate governance, as mentioned by Gabriel, paying attention to how corporations and what the standards are for corporations doing business in this given emerging market are. Looking at compliance programs. This could be compliance within a single firm or compliance through a voluntary association or standard setting organization. Through associations. Associations could be your business association, it could be the International Chamber, it could be the US Chamber. It could be associations that are founded by industry to incorporate greater and broader feedback. And lastly, looking at culture and norms and how to build norms and a better business culture that focuses on issues such as transparency, ethics, and making positive business investments to promote those positive externalities that keep the investments coming in. We focus on these 4 aspects, and all of that leads us to more sustainable, inclusive growth, giving more opportunities to more people in these emerging markets. And it leads to longer, more positive returns to both the local community and larger companies as well. Next slide. So back, I don't want to date myself, but many years ago when I went through my MBA, we had an ethics professor that would come in and play the song with some of the lyrics I pasted here in, it's a song, it's called Shades of Gray. So Dan and I didn't plan this, but Dan's comment about black and white issues versus shades of gray. Right? The local operating environment in many emerging markets is dealing in shades of gray. You have poor actors and you have good actors. And for organizations like CYPE, like those that Gabriel works with, like those that Dan works with, our mission, our job here is to make those organizations or to improve the governance and the operating environment as much as possible through various means in order to make it come into the light. We know that we're never going to get a pure operating environment. There's always going to be bad actors, right? But there are ways and methods and methodologies by which we can begin to move the market in a direction that's more transparent, that's more accountable, and that offers more opportunity. You know, things and politicians, as Dan brought up, they like to try and boil things down to right and wrong or a black and a white issue. A lot of times in business, there are no black and white issues. There are shades of gray. And so we have to recognize that this is the operating environment in which we work, where laws, regulations that are enforced and implemented by the governments that we're working with in these economies are often poorly implemented and do not work effectively to meet the policy objective of that regulation to begin with. They cause negative externalities like corruption. And so dealing with that and dealing with the world as it is and not with which we'd like it to be, we have to found and build things within these emerging markets that can move the needle ever so slightly towards a cleaner, more transparent operating environment. Next slide. So looking at voluntary standards, I don't think that we've defined them yet in the presentation, but these are non-governmental consensus standards. So these are standards that firms, nonprofit associations, civil society organizations, sometimes government regulators also enter into to form a common consensus. And as Dan mentioned, this consensus can move over time with the acquiescence of the members of those organizations. Now, in the absence of a rule of law or a strong rule of law or a strong tradition of law in a given emerging markets, to my mind, these voluntary associations can be a substitute or a placeholder for a legal system that is not yet effective. The codes of practice and influence that set these benchmarks for behavior in the market can then over time become incorporated within the legal and regulatory framework of that given emerging market. So we're talking about first movers here in the market, where the palm oil industry in much of the tropics is setting this standard higher than what might otherwise be required by local environmental and regulatory standards. But it's doing that, to one, make sure that its own supply chain and its own actors are acting in accordance with its own standards of integrity and ethics, but more so that over time, that this might shape how the broader government and regulators might view this issue. And lastly, this is a form of collective action, and SIPE is engaged in collective action against corruption, collective action for compliance standards all over the world in various guises. So what these voluntary standards do is allow the private sector to set a bar and then advocate for those standards to be implemented in a broad a sense as possible, and it lifts all of the actors along with it. Next slide. So this is about a process which builds trust, which leaves an institution. So the process is the physical work, the actual work that Dan does every day in getting those people around the table. And at the end of the day, it does come down to individuals. Individuals who have very different perspectives that come to the table with some mistrust among each other. And building that process, the act of engaging, of constructive dialogue, which over time will build trust within this community. Now, you're always going to have those bad actors, and as Dan mentioned, trying to bring those bad actors in is part of the objective of some of this work these voluntary associations does. So the bad actors aren't bad actors anymore. Over time, this builds trust. The trust that's inherent, through dialogue with the WWF and palm oil and local governance actors is built over this process, over years and years of engagement and dialogue, and it's going to have its ups and its downs. But over time, the hope is, or the objective is rather, to build the trust that will build a foundation, which will leave an institution behind. And so this is the institution that Dan works for, where you're in the absence of everything else that's going on in the world, whether it's a new political party that comes to power, whether it's an organization or a new actors in the industry or industry shifts, that this institution will be left and remain standing. It's a constant in the equation when you're in this industry. And so this is built in a variety of ways. It's built through representation. As Dan mentioned, they got that table bigger. So they brought more actors into the table, which with each additional actor brought more complexity to the problem, which again caused more headaches. But at the end of the day, it builds a more sustainable organization. It's about a correct use of carrots and sticks. So the carrots are financial incentive, could be listing requirements. There's a whole menu of potential carrots that could be offered through a voluntary association. But it's also about sticks, and that is, sanctions against the members or a mediation program, ways to which other association members will bring up the standards of the lowest in the organization. It's about measurement and accountability. Dan and I were talking in a pre-conference about how they're measuring and how they're holding members accountable. And there's a lot of stuff that goes into that, both local stakeholders on the ground, all the way up to satellite imagery. And finally, it's about building those bridges, between actors that might exist in silos and otherwise have no interaction with one another. And through those bridges, you're going to build that sustainable institution, which will then have impact on the further development of the organization. Next slide, please. So what does all that do? That plants the seeds for democratic dividends. So I have here the four characteristics of a democracy as laid out by Larry Diamond, who's at the Center for Democracy Development and Rule of Law at the Stanford University. Larry has laid out here four characteristics of a democracy. It's a political system for choosing and replacing the government through fair elections. So as Dan mentioned, they have an annual convention. And they have to set those new standards. So in a way, there is a mini democracy going on right within this organization. It's a political system choosing and replacing the standards and the members within that organization. Active participation in people and citizens. So in this specific example that we went over today, this is about the active participation of the members of the society. It's a protection of human rights. Well, human rights, we're talking about that with the social factors that Gabriel mentioned in his introduction. And it's about protecting labor standards and supply chain, protecting the integrity of that. And lastly, it's about a rule of law where procedures apply to all citizens. Now, obviously, these voluntary associations don't apply to everyone. But what they do is start to establish rules, processes, laws, if you want to call them that, but more voluntary agreements to equally apply to all members in that association. So if you see here, we can take the four factors as laid out by Larry Diamond and look at them as potential seeds for small democratic advances within within this emerging market. Next slide, please. So moving on, we try and create a win-win-win where we have a private sector win, a society win, and a government win. So from the private sector, we're building resilient supply chains. Now in the age of COVID, we're looking at companies with massive disruptions to supply chains. And what these associations do is build that trust and that organization around which companies can then build more resilience into their supply chains. As Gabriel mentioned at the beginning of the event, there are a lot of ESG measurement standards out there, more than even Bloomberg has. What this does is allow the private sector to begin to collect that data, to formalize the process, and to engage in a first mover type situation where they're collecting data that the industry feels as important from its perspective. And it also introduces predictability. By instituting these standards, by increasing transparency and accountability, what we're doing is adding to predictability, and business loves predictability. For society, both in society, locally, and then more broadly, we're introducing partnership and introducing them into the process. By introducing local governments and representatives of the local community into this process, we're building a partnership between the private sector, the government, and also local actors on the ground, which again builds trust. That it builds accountability for those that forest fire clearing that Dan was mentioning. And it builds in transparency into the process. People that live in the community, governments that are observing the community, local actors can all observe this process. And it reinforces that ability to look into the inner workings of these otherwise, more private or independent companies that are operating in their midst. And lastly, we turn to government. What does it give to the government? It gives investment or promotes investment and revenue because these companies are committed to a level of transparency. They're, through the association with this voluntary standards, they're emitting data that can then be used by the government to understand the size and scope of the industry and collect, at the end of the day, appropriate tax revenue. It involves responsibility. So the government then looks like an actor that is acting responsibly in this situation, absent any regulatory action, absent any effort on the government's behalf to regulate or to impose on this industry its own standards. And then lastly, as I mentioned before, what this does is offer a framework for regulation in the future. So the industry has already gathered in the palm oil industry in this case, and establish this certain framework for operation, what they think is most important. Now, going forward, as the government gains additional capacity to regulate, to observe, to enforce and implement those regulations, then the government can take some of these standards. It already understands what's important and what's valued in the sustainable operation of palm oil in this example, and then apply it in its own regulatory regime. Next slide. And then lastly, it brings us to Q&A, and I think it goes back to Michelle.
Thank you for that, Eric. That was a great tie to sort of all of the other presentations that we had. I think for me, the biggest takeaway is really understanding how corporations, while again, perhaps working in their own interests, end up developing standards which have this benefit to government, which is not necessarily their primary goal, but it sort of lifts everyone along the way. I have a few questions that have been placed in the chat box, so if you don't mind giving me just a second, they all sort of flow in and then I have to scroll through. So I'm just going to go up to the first question that we have, if I can find it, and this one will be for Gabrielle. So the question is, what role can NGOs like SIPE play in making sure that voluntary standards actually make democratic institutions stronger in countries where, for example, there might be a very weak rule of law? But I think anyone could help put input on that question.
Thank you, Michelle. That's a great question. So for SIPE and other civil society organizations, more broadly governments themselves, pardon me about that, they can require that civil society, they can require that voluntary standards are in place so as to improve transparency and traceability. There are benefits to transparency and traceability that are quite clear. One can look at the capital markets example of when Unilever sold off its baking division in 2018. In the fall of 2017. It was originally priced at $7 billion and it sold for about $8 billion, I believe, is to KKR. That was the division that Dan and RSPO had worked with for many years to improve the traceability of palm oil. Palm oil is an oil that's used in baking. Why did that matter to KKR? When one knows what's in one's supply chain, one can manage the risks. You have to measure to manage. To measure, to monitor, to manage. It's that simple. The same parallel occurs with civil society and governments. The more we understand and have access to data, the easier we can look at risks and opportunities and see how to manage those risks. So governments can, for example, start to require, or on a voluntary basis, ask for certification at port of call. Recently, a large palm oil company, for example, which I'll remain anonymous, sold $1.5 million of palm oil out of, I believe it's Port Buchanan out of Liberia. Liberia is a very small country in West Africa that has suffered through Ebola and many other risks, including a minor genocide. Why did that palm oil company, which in that quarter, its owner had gotten $140 million in net income, receive a tax holiday and not pay any tax to the government of Liberia? When the government of Liberia is struggling financially. So what we need to consider is the levers, whether from a regulatory perspective or voluntary perspective, for example, in trade, around certification. We recently released a report in my day job at Planet Tracker looking at traceability in the Japanese seafood market. The traceability via certification in the Japanese seafood market, which one might think is quite small, but from a notional value is valued at $134 billion. It's the B. Seafood is the 5th or 6th largest import and the 5th or 6th largest export out of Japan, 2% of its total exports at $15 to $17 billion a year. When they looked at traceability and certification and modeled that out for that sector, for obviously a global leader in a developed economy, we saw returns to companies increase by 2 times. So there is a direct incentive for SIPE, civil society, and governments in many levels, whether looking at environmental issues, social, as Dan has explained, social issues around supporting smallholders in democracy, or governance issues, to employ voluntary standards to improve risk management, which has demonstrated over and over again significant financial returns to investors and to the capital markets more broadly. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for that really in-depth response, Gabriel. You always give, I think, really great sort of real world what this means to businesses, and not only just the risk, but then you bring us great examples of the cost, right? And oftentimes in SIPE and our work and what we do, and we're talking about these issues of adhering to voluntary standards or for providing technical assistance, the question is, what is the business case? Why should I do this? Why does it matter? And of course, here we're talking about the fact that it matters because it raises standards overall, and it's very important for the companies and those who adhere to the standard, but then also the environment they're working in, the social, environmental, government environment. So I always appreciate that you give us that answer too, that is always lingering out there, which is, what's the business case? How does this impact my bottom line? Which I think is an important thing for us to also be sure that we're talking about. But before I go on to the next question, I would just like to remind our participants, if you do have a question, please go ahead and place your question into the chat function. I will read your question and hopefully we can continue on with our discussion. So I do have another question here, and this one is for Dan. It says, Mr. Stretche, it seems like the RSPO standard favors those companies that are big, Western, and may already be complying with the standard. What does RSPO do to help those companies that may have a harder time meeting the standard?
It's a great question. First, I'd say that it doesn't necessarily favor the Western companies, particularly from a producer perspective. What it does is it favors the companies that want to have market share in Western countries. And I think that's an extremely important point, because what we're doing is we're creating a value proposition. If you would like to do business in these countries and in these markets, you have to comply to these standards. And that may go beyond what the local governance requires. I mean, I think we have to be, we exist because sometimes the local governance is not what the buyer wants. And our goal is to create this value proposition in other markets. So we're working in China, we're working in India, we're working in Indonesia and Malaysia to create the value proposition for other companies to want to sell material into these markets that is certified, that is produced beyond what is locally required in some of the producing nations. And I think that that's important to note, because if you look at statistics, particularly coming out of the COVID situation, which there's been studies that link the zoological diseases, zootonic diseases to deforestation and climate change. The Gen Z and the millennials, who are the emerging class of consumers globally, not just in the United States or Europe, but globally, they want companies of purpose. They want companies that are not knowingly harming the environment and people. And that extends into markets in Asia as well. Southeast Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia, China. And all the statistics show us that if you can explain the value proposition, that they will demand it. Now, we don't want to wait for the consumer, to be honest. I think it might take too long. So what we want to do is start to talk to the governments and talk to the companies that are already operating there, and get them on board before the consumer asks, so that they do have the right answer when the consumer asks for sustainably sourced material. And this isn't just for palm oil. This extends into every commodity, whether it's soy, beef, or cattle, pulp and paper. All four of them are the largest drivers of deforestation globally. And all four should be sourced in a way that's not negatively impacting people on the ground and biodiversity. So I think what we can do to help these companies is we can give them the best of the best practices. That's what we do. I am probably the least smart person that works at the RSPO. We have people that are way smarter than me that have worked on agronomy and all kinds of other issues to develop the leading science and practices for growing the oil palm. And our membership has the leading scientists and others working on seeds and other types of techniques to grow this material. These are techniques that, as palm grows into new frontiers like Africa and Latin America, that we can give those best practices before. What we don't want is to create a situation where we see palm companies going into Africa and making the gorilla the next orangutan. That would be a horrible situation. We have a collective responsibility to develop agricultural sectors in a way that are not causing harm to the communities, to the workers, and biodiversity. And I think what we bring as well is that idea of transparency. Transparency is not normal for most actors in the agricultural sector. And I've worked in pulp and paper, and I've now worked on palm oil. Most people don't want to put your head up. When you put your head up, to use the war analogy, that's when you get shot in the head. But what we're asking our members to say, put your head up, take a stand, and also admit that you don't have it all perfect, that this is a process of continuous improvement, and that there are going to be challenges. There's going to be reports from civil society saying you don't have it right, but that's okay, because you have to have, I'm in this for the long game. We're all in this for the long game. If you think you're going to fix an agricultural sector and a commodity sector in just a few years, that's laughable. We have to be playing this for the long game, understanding there's urgency because of climate change, but systemic change will take years to implement. And to bring people into the fold, we have to reward them as well. So we need to the person that's trying, the company that's trying to do it the right way, the company that's investing in smallholders, maybe they're a downstream company like a Unilever or a Walmart, reward them. They're trying to do the right thing, and they're trying to drive impact on the ground, which is better for everyone, and it's better for democracy, and it's better for transparency, and it's better for the palm oil industry.
Great. Thank you so much for that. Really, I think, insightful sort of answer to the question. So I think one of the things that sort of, when you're talking about, Gen Z and how they're the next age of consumer and sort of what they're looking for. I think that's what we do call reputational risk, right? If you do something and your consumer doesn't think that's ethical or has a problem with the way that you operate, this could mean, loss in revenues for you. So one other thing, I sort of kind of have a dual question, sort of to piggyback off of what you were asking for Eric and for Gabrielle. So for Eric, I'm wondering if you can talk to us a little bit how these sort of the reputational risk issues end up helping to support governance, because I think there's a bit of a tie there. And then I'm wondering for Gabrielle, are there some other industries where we really see this sort of reputational risk sort of bleeding in and also sort of impacting the way that companies might think about and attempt to adhere or maybe not adhere to a standard?
Thanks, Michelle. So the reputational risk is real. And it's more apparent in companies that are listed and have an active float, right? So there's a quantitative news story comes out September 20th, share price affected on September 21, and that's measurable. But not all companies are listed, and in fact, a majority of companies are not listed. They're held privately. They're family firms, and so what's in it for them is the question that you have to ask. Yes, there's a certain reputation. There's elements of wanting to be a good steward if you're a locally owned firm. But more than that, it's about making the business case for following these standards, sustainability. So if you have a family-owned business and you're in agriculture, right? You want that farm or that agricultural holding to still produce for your next generation and the generation after that. You want that to stay in the family business, in the family hands. And so by entering into voluntary associations and associations that set these standards, what you're doing is adding a level of security or a level of predictability into that process. I will say an issue that commonly comes up with these voluntary standard setting associations is liability risk, right? And as Dan has mentioned, that companies have gotten really whacked. They have to disclose information in order to be evaluated. And if you're sitting in the boardroom or sitting in a managerial role, the last thing that you want to do is disclose more information that could potentially then harm your corporation or your entity. So there has to be a balance, a way to balance the liability risks that are inherent and that are real. And there should be some kind of legal recourse there with the alternative, which is to do nothing and keep everything as quiet and hush-hush as possible, right? So we can't have, everyone going around suing everybody for every infraction. We also can't have, the super secret company that doesn't disclose anything and wants to maintain a lid on all of its operations. So we're trying to find this balance between the two. And I think that we're still going through that process. What's the appropriate balance between the two extremes? I think that we're not there yet, and that as Dan mentioned earlier in his presentation, when a member of the standard setting organization is in the newspaper, right? And then the organization is saying, oh, well, obviously, it's a big problem. What I think when I read that in the FT or the Wall Street Journal is that, good, it was disclosed, it was discovered, and it will be remedied, right? We see this about, money laundering scandals, through banks in the Balkans. And when I read about the scandals about money laundering, what I say is, good, the regulatory system eventually worked and people will be prosecuted, people will be held accountable. In other countries that are less transparent, less secure, less financial regulation, those deals are still going on. So when I see something happen, in the newspaper and someone gets caught, to me, it's a good thing. The process is working. There's accountability, and things will be fixed. So Gabriel, you can take it from there.
No, Eric, thank you so much. And again, thank you, Michelle. These are very thoughtful questions from the audience. And again, I really would encourage you to reach out to us. All these questions are part of the dialogue. I mean, Dan and I as professionals, I don't know if we answer any questions any day, maybe I'm speaking for you, Dan, but mostly what we do is talk through different ideas and help others navigate towards their own solution that's best for their own institution. So, thinking more broadly, we've talked a bit about palm oil, but there are examples. I'm going to briefly go through a laundry list here: elephants, whales. At this point, got to cut me off. What? Chocolate, trees, fish, aquaculture, and accounting. And I'm going to take just a couple minutes, just about a couple seconds for each one. Because I want to so for example, on elephants and whales, it's a public good. Why would it matter to a country or a community? International Monetary Fund, the rabble-rousing and green ecology group, International Monetary Fund, and that's a joke there, recently published a leading study on their website that's reviewed that says each elephant is worth $2 million to the local economy, and each whale is worth $1 million to the local economy. That's incredible. Why would chocolate matter? There are standards on chocolate, right? I'll give you an example. And there's like Rainforest Alliance and many other standards. But why was one of the leading chocolate producing companies in the world delisted off the London Stock Exchange? It was not transparent about its attempted ownership in land grabbing in Peru. That led to up to 10,000 hectares, 25,000 acres to be deforested, and allegedly, I'm going to say allegedly, I'm going to emphasize this, tragically, some people were killed. That's United Cacao. They were delisted and removed from the London Stock Exchange, and they did not have transparency on ownership. Let's talk about timber, the company that I used to cover when I was in the buy side, Lumber Liquidators. 2013, they were at about $110 a share. A great company, great flooring. I have bought flooring from Lumber Liquidators decades ago, right? Loved it. Then I read a not-for-profit civil society report by the Environmental Investigation Agency, one of your peers, that highlighted that the timber they were saying was Chinese oak was actually taken or stolen out of Russia and out of Russian protected areas that were in place to protect tiger habitat. So this was an issue on the one hand around E, environment, but more importantly around G, governance. They were then importing that timber into the US. US customs officials fined them for mislabeling purposefully their timber as Chinese oak, lying to the consumer. They got fined for about $13 million. The Richmond-based company, its CEO moved on, resigned, and then they had a subsequent risk on formaldehyde that was covered by 60 Minutes. Their share price went from about $110 to $20. The day I read that report in 2013, I went into my portfolio manager and said, we're going to sell now. And we did, thank God. Let's talk briefly about trees and accounting standards. We've been talking about voluntary, environmental, social, and governance standards. Let's talk about accounting standards. There's one accounting standard, International Accounting Standard 41, and please pardon the dogs if you hear them. There are 3 dogs here. International Accounting Standard covers the tree and the fruit before it's squeezed. Orange tree, orange fruit, not orange juice. Okay? Think about it that way. Covers $3.3 trillion of the global economy is under this standard. $3.3 trillion. When it's not yet consistently applied around the world. That's why Bloomberg had a wonderful title called Scallop Apocalypse. The leading scallop rancher in the world was hit with 3 write-downs of $264 million total over 4 years, and their book value plummeted 99% as they were not being accurate around the climate environmental risks associated with their 500,000 acre scallop ranch. And trust me, when I had to research and write about that, I learned all sorts of new words. That was misreported under International Accounting Standard 41. The CEO was fined and 23 executives were barred from industry, and the company was delisted. On the good side, now we're going to talk about trees. Stora Enso, one of the largest pulp and paper manufacturers in the world, out of Finland. They also have an energy footprint. They looked at accounting standards and they adopted accounting standards recently to more accurately fit the growth and production cycle of trees. Right? Trees grow in a cyclical fashion, like an S-curve, year over year, just like palm oil does. Dan will tell you it takes 3 to 5 years for a palm oil tree to be able to start to produce fruit. Similarly for pulp and paper. When they reassessed and reapplied accounting standards, particular number 41, accurately, sell-side analysts applauded them for improving their governance, and they received an equity price lift. So again, to summarize, standards can be beyond what we do have right now with elephants and whales, and the IMF has reported on this. They have a really fun podcast you can listen to when you're jogging or something out of lockdown. Chocolate, you have Rainforest Alliance. It's critical to assess the ownership of who owns what. To mitigate risk, potentially violence, sadly, but also deforestation and other issues, and to empower communities. Around timber, we see the example of Stora Enso versus lumber liquidators. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Gabrielle. And no worries about the dogs. I have pets who've been trying to meet you all this entire presentation and this entire event. But I want to tie Dan in a little bit here, and I think we'll probably have just enough time to get his answer. We've talked about this reputational risk, and then we've talked about the cost. Can you tell me a little bit about sort of RSPO's grievance and complaints mechanisms, and sort of how that ties into sort of the things that we're talking about?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting concept with voluntary standards, is that many of us, and the RSPO specifically, we have a really complex or comprehensive, sorry, not complex, well, I guess it's a little bit complex, but comprehensive complaints and grievance system. And what we find is that that system, you know, to Eric's point about he's happy to see it in the news. You know, a lot of people are unhappy to see us have complaints. But the fact is, to me, that means the system is working. And it also means that sometimes when affected parties on the ground are not getting recourse through the local jurisdiction or through the local governance model, that they do have another place to go. And we've seen this happen in Indonesia, Malaysia. We're also seeing it in Africa and Latin America, where sometimes where they didn't even know they had this option, that they had free prior informed consent, that the company had to come to them before they developed the plantation, and they file a complaint, and we have to look into it. And it's a really good system that we're working with a community engagement strategy to actually socialize it. So if you think about it, we're almost out there looking for more complaints. And that sounds counterintuitive, like why would you want more complaints? It undermines the credibility of your standard. But for many of us, we actually think it strengthens the standard, because that means that we're giving recourse to those that typically have not had a voice. When you're a small local community and a large corporation comes and tries to develop land that may be really valuable to you from a cultural perspective, not just even biodiversity perspective, you should have a say in what happens with that land, and we need to hear those voices. So I think it's a really unique opportunity where we see an extra layer of governance where perhaps others are not acting at that point.
Great, and thank you so much for that. I think that is all that we have time for today. I want to thank you, Dan, and also Gabrielle, and also Eric. This has been a really great conversation on the sort of hidden benefits of voluntary standards and emerging markets. I appreciate your time. I appreciate all of our guests. If you have any questions for us to the attendees, please be sure to contact us at acgc@sipe.org. You may also follow us on Twitter. I really appreciate everyone's time here. These are always great sort of exercises to think through really important issues. And we're glad to have you here, and we hope to see you at our next ACGC event. Thank you, everyone.